Hello.
Welcome to The Debate. So to start us off, if you walked into a hospital, right, for a really complex surgery,
Mm-hmm.
and the lead surgeon walked in holding like a medieval spell book instead of a scalpel, you would immediately walk out.
Right. Yeah, you'd be terrified.
Exactly. You wouldn't care how beautifully bound the book was or, how many generations of his family had used it. You would recognize instantly that he lacked the empirical tools for the reality of the situation.
Absolutely.
So my question is, why are millions of young adults today expected to accept incredibly complex financial, medical, and geopolitical advice from religious leaders who possess absolutely zero empirical training in those fields?
Well, the short answer is because the human mind possesses a really profound, almost desperate intolerance for uncertainty. And historically, the institution of religion served as the ultimate mechanism for resolving that uncertainty. You know?
Sure, historically.
Right. But I think your hospital analogy, while striking, kind of misdiagnoses the core issue. I don't look at modern religious institutions like a hospital run by sorcerers. I look at it more like, well, like an open-source software code.
Okay, software, how so?
It's an incredibly elegant, foundational operating system that was originally designed to align human intellect with ethical reality. But over centuries, localized tribes, political actors, and nationalistic governments have bloated that elegant code with, honestly, terrible, localized malware.
And my argument today is that malware has completely overtaken the system.
Right.
Today, we are exploring a tension that is driving a massive demographic shift. The central question is, are modern religious practices becoming entirely indistinguishable from cultural and nationalist traditions? And we are directing this analysis specifically toward young adults.
Yeah, a generation that is actively, and I would argue rightfully, questioning the relevance and the authority of organized institutions today.
Exactly. And our discussion is grounded in recent sociological and theological critiques that examine the exact intersection where original faith, national identity, and modern superstition just violently collide.
And we're going to look at the exact mechanisms of that collision. I will be arguing that while nationalistic and cultural overlays absolutely exist, and they're highly destructive, let's be real, the distinct intellectual first principles of faith remain entirely intact. The core code is still there.
Mm-hmm.
It can, and it absolutely must, be separated from the superficial human manipulation that currently surrounds it.
Right. And I will be taking the opposite stance. I'm arguing that the institution has completely devolved. It has become the malware. Organized religion today functions largely as a delivery mechanism for cultural dogmas and performative tribal practices. It completely distorts its original teachings.
Wow. Completely?
Completely. The structural failure is so profound that the most intellectually honest choice for a young adult is to just log off that system entirely.
Well, that's a compelling argument, but have you considered what happens when you abandon a foundational operating system without a viable replacement? We'll get into the alternatives shortly, but I fundamentally disagree that the system is beyond repair.
I see why you think that. I do. But let me give you a different perspective on what the system actually looks like on the ground right now.
Go for it.
We are witnessing a systemic failure where institutional religion has been entirely subsumed by cultural identity. What we're seeing today is the phenomenon of modern religious figures utterly abandoning their original spiritual mandates to behave, functionally speaking, like witch doctors.
Wait, hold on. Witch doctors is a very heavy accusation. How are you defining that operationally?
I define it by the total reliance on myth and superstition to bypass the need for actual skill, qualification, or experience. I mean, you see these individuals credentialed by the state or their specific religious institution stepping completely out of their lane.
Okay, I see what you're saying.
They rely entirely on the aesthetics of ancient authority. They stand in front of their congregations dressed in highly traditional garb. We're talking shawls, specific headscarves, ornate robes.
Yeah, the whole visual performance.
Exactly. Sometimes literally carrying a staff. And using the immense visual weight of that tradition, they confidently preach on incredibly complex, entirely unrelated subjects.
Right.
You have a mufti or a priest giving absolute directives on the nuances of cancer surgery. You have them offering binding advice on the viability of investing in Tesla stock or, the biological mechanics of conceiving a child. It is an intellectual overreach of staggering proportions.
I mean, I don't disagree that the overreach exists, and it is undeniably damaging.
But it's not just a minor overreach. It's the core operational model of these institutions today. They use their religious authority as a universal skeleton key to unlock doors they have absolutely no business opening. Young adults are observing this and correctly recognizing it for what it is, a total loss of actual faith in favor of a superficial pick-and-mix cultural identity. The institution demands conformity to these absurdities. It demands that you treat the man in the shawl as an omniscient guru. And in doing so, it proves it's lost its moral and intellectual foundation.
I come at it from a different way. While it is true that specific political and cultural actors have weaponized the script of religion for their own relevance, the core metaphysical and moral foundations of these faiths remain structurally distinct from these localized traditions.
Do they, though?
They do. The original texts explicitly champion intellect and empirical reasoning over primitive superstition. For instance, in the major theological frameworks, humanity's distinguishing feature isn't emotional subservience, it's the intellect.
Right.
It's the cognitive capacity to discern truth from falsehood.
Okay, but if the foundational text champions the intellect, why does the modern institution actively suppress it?
Well, the problem isn't that the original design of faith is indistinguishable from culture. The problem is that modern society, suffering from what the source material aptly describes as a digital lobotomy, has lost the cognitive resilience required to extract those true first principles.
A digital lobotomy?
Exactly. We have a crisis of human intellect, not a failure of the original spiritual design. You are conflating the very worst behavioral corruptions of a specific demographic of leaders with the entire epistemological framework of the religion itself.
I want to stop you right there, because I am really struggling with this defense. You are separating the pure text from the flawed leaders, but the leaders are the sole interface through which young adults experience the text.
Not necessarily the sole interface, but go on.
For the vast majority, they are. Let's drill down into this witch doctor phenomenon, because it perfectly encapsulates the death of true scholarship. A young person walks into a place of worship seeking ethical grounding. Instead, they are lectured by a man whose only qualification is his religious attire, telling them how to navigate the modern financial markets. That isn't just a flaw in the system, that is the system working exactly as designed to maintain control.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why. You are presenting this omniscience as the intended design of the institution, but it's actually a deeply human, market-driven failing.
Market-driven?
Yes. Let's look at the mechanism of how this happens. A congregation experiences the terrifying complexities of modern life. Economic instability, terminal illness, cultural shifts. They are desperate for certainty. So, they project this demand for omniscience onto their local religious leader. The leader, terrified of losing relevance in an attention economy, capitulates. They offer a quick fix. They preach on Tesla stock. Because if they say, "I don't know, consult a financial advisor," they lose the congregation's attention to a podcaster who does claim to know.
So you're saying the religious leader is just a victim of market demand?
Not a victim, no, but a participant in a flawed social dynamic. We must contrast these figures with genuine scholars. For instance, the material points to specific scholars in places like Indonesia who strictly stay in their lane.
Okay, that's fair.
When a genuine, textually grounded scholar is asked a question regarding physical health or complex finance, they openly admit it is outside their training. They defer to the medical doctor, they defer to the economist. True spiritual traditions explicitly demand deep humility and the pursuit of actual, verifiable knowledge.
Right. The whole Socratic approach.
Exactly. The famous Socratic paradox, "I know that I know nothing," is deeply embedded in genuine faith. The failure belongs to the corrupt individuals who lack the courage to admit ignorance, not the underlying philosophy.
That's an interesting point, though I would frame it differently. If the philosophy consistently manifests as corruption in, say, 90% of its modern iterations, at what point do we acknowledge the system is producing the result it is currently optimized for?
I wouldn't agree with the 90% metric, but I see your point.
You mentioned the congregation projecting their fears, but these institutions are actively cultivating that exact dependency. They are weaponizing the script. And this brings us to how faith is being completely distorted by nationalistic narratives. We no longer have a universal ethical framework. Faith has been meticulously siloed into nationalistic brands.
How do you mean?
I mean that a believer today is essentially expected to practice a specific Turkish variation of faith, or an Afghan variation, or an American evangelical variation. The original universal moral foundation, which supposedly applied to all human beings regardless of geography, has been entirely overwritten.
Overwritten by what?
By local cultural rules, tribal habits, and explicit government-sponsored propaganda. The institution acts as an arm of the state designed to divide and control people, convincing them that their localized geographic superstition is the divine truth.
Yeah, that's a dark reality.
It is. When a religion is reduced to national borders, it ceases to be a universal truth and becomes mere cultural baggage.
Look, that is undeniably true of how governments operate today. Governments manipulating faith as an administrative weapon to enforce geopolitical loyalty is a modern reality.
Right.
But it absolutely does not erase the historical mechanism of what the faith's original revolutionary nature actually achieved. Consider the early expansions of these religious frameworks. They actively provided physical and intellectual safety for forward-thinking individuals, people fleeing persecution from various empires.
Wait, hold on. How does a religious framework provide intellectual safety if it inherently demands adherence to a dogma?
Because true faith, in its purest expression, establishes a metaphysical baseline that supersedes the emperor's whims. By establishing that ultimate authority rests outside of the human domain, it actually decoupled the individual's intellect from the immediate demands of the local warlord or the state.
Oh, I see.
Yeah. It provided sanctuary to think and philosophize, provided they adhered to baseline ethical frameworks. True faith is actually the ultimate antidote to nationalism. It demands that you prioritize the universal human intellect, the unique capacity for reason, over local tribalism.
But that's not what's happening now.
The fact that modern governments have successfully propagandized the masses into confusing their national flag with their holy texts is a tragedy of mass manipulation. It is malware. It is not proof that the core operating system was inherently flawed.
Okay, let's play with your software analogy for a second. The historical sanctuary you're referencing might have been a brilliant version 1.0 of the software, centuries ago. But that version is entirely inaccessible to the young adult living today.